The studio was like any other. Polished floors, strategically placed lights, and a backdrop designed for digital consumption. It smelled faintly of hand sanitizer and the sharp tang of buffalo sauce. The show was simple. A host interviewing a celebrity as they ascended a fiery gauntlet of increasingly spicy chicken wings. But tonight, the stakes were different. He arrived under a flickering neon sign outside the studio. His black hoodie pulled low over his face. Despite his international fame, he moved like a shadow, slipping past the gawking production assistants with an aura of quiet confidence. The producers greeted him warmly, but he felt a faint unease, as though he'd stepped into a trap. The host, a charismatic, sharp-witted man in his late 30s, met him at the table. The setup was familiar. 10 wings laid out in ascending order of heat, each one accompanied by a sauce with a name that sounded like a warning. Behind the cameras, the crew bustled, testing angles and adjusting sound levels. The show began with its usual rhythm. The first few wings were easy, mere warm-ups for his experienced palate. He joked about his upbringing, his rise to fame, and the stories behind his most celebrated works. The audience watching at home would be enthralled, unaware that something unseen had begun to unfold. By the fourth wing, the heat started to build. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, reaching for the glass of milk provided. The host grinned mischievously, asking pointed questions that probed deeper into his personal life. It was then that he noticed it. A strange flicker in the host's eyes, as if they glowed faintly red for just a second. He blinked, chalking it up to the spice-induced haze. The fifth wing was coated in a sauce called Demon's Tongue. The warning label on the bottle was absurdly dramatic, claiming it was made from peppers grown in cursed soil. He bit into the wing, and the burn hit immediately, searing his mouth and throat like molten lava. His vision blurred for a moment, and the host leaned in, his smile razor-sharp. "How are you holding up?" the host asked, his voice carrying an odd resonance, like a distant echo. "I've had spicier," he lied, his voice hoarse. He reached for the milk again, but his hand trembled. As the questions continued, the host's demeanor shifted. His tone grew darker, more probing, as if he were peeling back the layers of his soul. The questions became uncomfortably personal, delving into fears he had never voiced, regrets he thought he'd buried. Each wing seemed to unlock a new level of vulnerability, as though the sauce carried some dark alchemy that forced him to confront his deepest secrets. By the eighth wing, the studio began to feel wrong. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. The crew stood frozen, their expressions blank, as if they were no longer present. The host's eyes were unmistakably glowing now, twin embers that bore into him. "Tell me," the host said, his voice impossibly deep, "do you regret it?" Quote, "Regret what?" he managed to choke out, his throat raw from the heat. The host gestured to the next wing, drenched in a sauce called Eternal Flame. The bottle's label depicted a skeleton writhing in agony. "You know what?" the host said. "Everything. The choices you've made, the people you've hurt." He stared at the wing, his heart pounding. The sauce seemed to pulse, emitting a faint red glow. He could feel the weight of the host's gaze, the unspoken challenge. To eat the wing was to confront something he didn't understand, something ancient and malevolent, driven by a mix of pride and defiance. He took a bite. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It wasn't just heat. It was as if the sauce were alive, searing through his veins, igniting every nerve ending. His vision went white, and he felt himself falling, tumbling into an endless void. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the studio. He stood in a desolate wasteland, the ground cracked and glowing with molten lava. The sky was a swirling vortex of fire and ash. In the distance, he saw a figure approaching, a shadowy silhouette with eyes like burning coals. "You've crossed the threshold," the figure said, its voice a symphony of whispers and roars. Few have dared to taste the flames of truth. "What is this place?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "This is the Inferno," the figure replied. "A realm where the soul is tested, where your darkest truths are laid bare. Each wing you consumed brought you closer to this moment. Now, you must answer for the life you've lived." The figure raised a hand, and scenes from his life played out in the fiery sky. Moments of triumph and failure, love and loss, joy and pain. He saw the faces of those he'd hurt and those he'd inspired. The weight of his choices pressed down on him, and he fell to his knees. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked, tears streaming down his face. "To offer you a choice," the figure said. "You can walk away now, forget this ever happened, and return to your life unchanged. Or you can take one more bite, face the final truth, and earn redemption or damnation." He looked down to find a single wing in his hand, coated in a sauce so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. The choice was his, summoning every ounce of courage. He took the bite. The pain was indescribable, a firestorm that consumed his very being. But as he endured it, he felt something shift. The weight on his soul began to lift, replaced by a profound clarity. He saw himself not as a celebrity or an icon, but as a flawed, complex human being, capable of both great harm and great good. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the studio. The lights were steady, the crew was bustling, and the host was smiling as if nothing had happened. "You made it," the host said, his tone warm and genuine. "Congratulations." He stared at the host, searching for any trace of the infernal presence he had encountered. But the host's eyes were normal, his demeanor unassuming. Had it all been a hallucination? A trick of the mind brought on by the heat? The interview ended, and he walked out of the studio into the cool night air. As he reached into his pocket for his car keys, his fingers brushed against something small and cold. He pulled it out. A tiny, charred feather, blackened at the edges but glowing faintly red at its core. He stared at it, his heart pounding. The Inferno wasn't done with him. Not yet.